We've cleared the first hurdle, we've got an audience. Every speaker always lives in fear that they'll turn up and no one else will turn up. I remember the surgeon, Chris O'Brien, who tragically died of brain cancer a few years ago. He used to tell a marvellous story that he once turned up at a speaking engagement and he looked out and there was one person in the audience. And he was due to speak for 45 minutes. So he said, look, rather than me go through all these slides and talk, why don't we just go and have a coffee and I'll talk you through it. And there was a woman, she said, no, look, you've gone to all this trouble, give me the slides, give me the speech. So he did, he went through it, 45 minutes, did the presentations, even took questions from the audience member, and she was polite enough to ask one or two, and he said, okay, well, I think that just about does it. Why don't we go and have that coffee? And she said, I can't, I'm the next speaker. So thanks for turning up. The book, Man Bites Murdoch, comes out in paperback in August, so I've been busy working on a foreword for the book in recent days. And so I've been reflecting on the state of newspapers probably quite a bit. And whenever I do, an old joke keeps coming back to me. So here's the joke. A man walks into a bar with a frog perched on the top of his head. Geez, mate, says the wide-eyed barman as the customer chests the bar. Where'd you get that? I don't really know, replies the frog. It started as a boil on my bum. Now, some of you might be confused by that and the link to the problems of newspapers, but you wouldn't be the first. I was at the Sydney Writers' Festival a couple of weeks ago on a panel with the food critic and travel writer A.A. Gill. He's a charming man with strong opinions that he expresses loudly and often. After I delivered the frog joke, which you'll eventually see is actually an analogy, he exclaimed in front of an audience of hundreds, "What the hell does that mean? That's ridiculous." To which I replied, if you be patient, I promise you it will make sense. So please be patient, it will make sense eventually. In the 10 months since the first publication of Man Bites Murdoch, the state of print has become even more precarious. Newspaper circulations and readerships continue to fall. Scores of jobs have been lost or retooled as whole layers of production have been stripped out in ways that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. We were seeing that unfold at Fairfax. Proprietors and publishers are looking to Apple and Android tablets in the hope that they'll cure what many believe is a terminal illness. Now, it's been 15 years since newspaper websites first started springing up across the Australian media landscape, and as I detail in the book, managements embrace them reluctantly, for the most part shifting resources to the new entities rather than seriously investing in them. I actually launched the Age website in 1996. We staffed it with 3 people across 24 hours, so compared to today's offerings it was quite limited. Now, there's a scene in The Godfather, the Francis Ford Coppola masterpiece, which is airing on cable television recently, when the consigliere, played by Robert Duvall, tells reluctant family members that they might as well broaden their business interests to include drug distribution, because if we don't, someone else will. That was pretty much the attitude of Australia's major print companies when online first surfaced. In fact, it remained that way until quite recently in some quarters. I swear a senior News Limited executive used that exact phrase to me in 2007 when we were trying to juggle scarce print resources and the need to invest more heavily online. If we don't do it, Bruce, someone else will. Now, I draw no comparisons at this point between News Limited and the Corleone family, although others might. Anyway, the commitment by newspaper companies to online was begrudging at best. Internet sites were seen as parasites. Now, you can see the joke is beginning to make sense. Devouring precious newsroom resources that most editors would have preferred stay with their print products. After all, that's where the money was, and what windfall profits they were. It's all very well for proprietors to squeal and moan now about how little profit they're making, but back in the day, 30 cents in every dollar of revenue routinely dropped to the bottom line profit year after year after year. You could ask for and get $100 from someone just wanting to advertise their garage sale for 4 lines of type in the Saturday Age, over and over again. so no wonder they were called rivers of gold. Together with strong circulations and healthy display advertising, it was known as the three-legged business model, and it sustained a golden era of easy money. It also meant that newspaper managers and proprietors were pretty much in denial for more than a decade. They stuck with what worked rather than innovating or embracing change. There was too little innovation, and what there was designed to make the product cheaper rather than better. So, of course, it was difficult to get management to focus on the internet. It was costly, and worse, profits seemed distant and almost inconsequential. The wretched thing was little more than a parasite gnawing away at a damn good business. Now the three-legged model is teetering, and I realise that I think I've just mixed my metaphors there. In fact, this whole speech could be a mixed metaphor. But at least managements now seem to accept that the new digital platforms are no longer threats to the business, they are the business, providing the best chances of print journalism to survive in compelling and profitable form. The parasite, if you like, has taken over the host. There you go, the other shoe drops, there's the joke. In his book 30, The Collapse of the Great American Newspaper, Charles M. Madigan noted that for a long time, newspapers got by on the notion that people would pay to know what happened today that didn't happen yesterday, dressed up and delivered tomorrow. Observe Madigan, today news is something that happened an instant ago. Of course it is. If a problem identified truly is a problem half solved, then at least there's some hope for print now. But shame on all those publishers and all those managers who dithered for so long. They needed to get as creative in their thinking as they did in their cost-cutting. The goal must now be to create compelling journalism across all the platforms available: print, mobile, tablet and internet. Each has to be distinctly different but complementary, otherwise print is dead. Of course, it's easier said than done, particularly by someone who's no longer editing, but I hold out hope. It's going to take some vision, which, as my book demonstrates again and again, has been in short supply in big print for some time. Newspapers, I believe, will increasingly push to the internet the set pieces and daily reports that everyone else has in favour of analysis and deeper reporting. Papers have to give us information we can't get elsewhere. The more they do that, the more compelling they'll become. Ultimately, the media companies that own trust will prosper. Newspapers will survive, I believe, but they'll do so under very different cost and revenue structures. The days of 30 to 40% profit margins are gone. Maybe proprietors will have to get by on 5 to 10%, but that's still a pretty good business, especially for a product that comes out every day. If you go to a supermarket, they're operating pretty much on about a 1 to 3% profit margin for their everyday items. Of course, those reduced margins might be a problem for existing proprietors and ultimately have implications for journalism, because the enormous proceeds of that three-legged business model have propped up journalism at The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald and other newspapers around Australia. It allowed for foreign bureaus and specialist reporters in areas as diverse as transport and religion, at City Hall, at Town Hall and at State Parliament. As has been noted elsewhere, the risk now, as revenues dry up, is that we could lose frontline reporting in favour of endless commentary in the blogosphere, which spends half its time ridiculing the Fourth Estate while stealing from it remorselessly. Now, the extraordinary period of change in which the Fourth Estate became the so-called Fifth Estate provides the backdrop for Man Bites Murdoch, a memoir of my 40 years in print journalism and inevitably the 6 days in court this time last year that attracted nationwide interest. But if the print industry has become more self-aware of the problems that confront it since I wrote the book, the company at the centre of many of the events, Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, clearly hasn't. It continues to experiment with different business models in the hope of making a buck out of digital. Only this week it announced the introduction of a paywall around some editorial content at The Australian. They're not alone there. In fact, just about every publisher in the world is experimenting with paywalls, and they're looking to companies like News to show a lead. Actually, I think The Australian has a unique opportunity to redefine the whole notion of paywalls. I reckon they could put a great deal of their content behind a wall, and a very large number of people would actually pay to make sure it stayed there. I think the Greens would go for that idea big time. Anyway, I'm not surprised that News is searching for new business models, because certainly the last circulation figures would have given them pause. The company shed about 126,000 copies a day, Monday to Saturday, in the just completed March audit, with my old paper, the Herald Sun, faring worst of all. It didn't so much dip below 500,000 sales, which had always been the kind of the Plimsoll line for that newspaper. It plummeted, shedding tens of thousands of copies on every day of the week. Meanwhile, The Age, a paper I've also edited in which News likes to routinely attack and disparage, actually put on circulation across most of the week. Now the two papers are trading blows over allegations of plagiarism, with The Age convinced the Herald Sun has been lifting stories without attribution. It's a sin in most journalism circles, but at some tabloids it's almost a standard practice. I recall at a News Limited confab some years ago, the then news editor of Rupert Murdoch's London Sun was asked what he did when all the other daily newspapers hit the street and he didn't have a story that they had. Well, we hit the phones and we try to match it, said Tom Petrie. Yeah, but what if you can't match it? Someone asked from the audience. Well then, said Petrie, we bring in the heavy lifting equipment. Now, has the Herald Sun been using heavy lifting equipment? I don't know. They deny it, but The Age is convinced, in recent days citing a few other examples as well. To me, it's all a bit of theatre that almost belongs in another era. It's a sideshow. I never particularly minded when a rival newspaper shamelessly lifted one of our stories, because I felt that we would always benefit from the comparison. The story that's at the centre of the latest plagiarism row is the report that former Deputy Police Commissioner Sir Ken Jones was under investigation by the Office of Police Integrity. The Age came out with the story, and in the second edition of the Herald Sun had miraculously also discovered the story. That wouldn't have bothered me particularly, because I think if you put the two papers side by side, it would be obvious who had done the work. And I think it's that depth that increasingly readers will be looking for in their newspapers. Actually, just while I'm on Fleet Street, when it was at its peak, there was a short, plump, heavily suntanned man who made his living out of getting the details of what was going to be in the first editions. Nefariously, he would get the details and then share it with particular newspaper editors, so they would avoid the shame and embarrassment of being knocked off, as we call it in the industry, by another paper. He'd seen a business opportunity and he'd made the most of it. I presume he inveigled printers and who knows who else to get this information, you know, before anyone else. He made a lot of money. In fact, he became rich on this. So he was able to spend most of his time on the Costa Brava, hence the suntan. I'm not sure what the truth is in the plagiarism row, and I'm sure it'll blow over pretty quickly, but certainly the conduct of News continues to spark debate and rebuke, and not just in Australia, where it dominates print in what I think is increasingly accepted as an unhealthy way. In the 10 months since the original publication of Man Bites Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch celebrated his 80th birthday, and the company he's guided to extraordinary size and global influence became mired in an appalling journalistic scandal in the United Kingdom. It was an unfortunate juxtaposition for Rupert Murdoch. Known as Hackergate, the proprietor assured us it was the work of one or two rogue reporters. Well, actually, it wasn't. Hackergate exemplifies the worst of News Limited. It smacks of their end justifies the means culture, and if you get caught, do or say whatever it takes to make the wretched business go away. After extensive investigation by principally The Guardian, it emerged that the practice of hacking into the voicemail messages of celebrities and politicians and other British notables was almost routine and systemic at Murdoch's News of the World newspaper. It was a sordid and wholly unethical means of getting stories that would in turn drive sales of Rupert's biggest selling tabloid. The company is now busy writing cheques to litigants, both actual and potential, in the hope that the whole sorry mess goes away. But as police finally mount a serious investigation into the Hackergate scandal, it may prove too late for that. But should anyone really be surprised when you've got this incredible competition amongst newspapers to get stories first? Of course, corners are going to be cut, but good companies don't allow it to happen. My own treatment by News uncovered an appalling lack of process and transparency within the company, in that yet they seem unable to admit, much less confront their failings. The company's response to publication of Man Bites Murdoch was almost as instructive as the events that immediately preceded it. It was a continuation of the policy I had enunciated on the courthouse steps immediately after our victory. They played the man, not the ball. Here's what the Australian wrote about me soon after publication of the book, and I'm not making this up. Guthrie never had a hair out of place, and his tie was always perfectly knotted like that of a shop window dummy, wrote one news columnist just days after the launch. He was writing about my time as editor of the Weekend Australian magazine. It was a period in my career that was undoubtedly successful for both my employer and me, yet here I was being denounced for my grooming. What? Actually, as anyone who's ever spent any time in a newspaper office can attest, if you show up with matching socks, you're often accused of overdressing. So we shouldn't take it too seriously. But it was puerile stuff that set the tone for subsequent days. In time, a whole host of columnists took shots. Every chapter of Man Bites Murdoch strikes me as unethical, wrote one particularly prominent polemicist, taking me to task over key revelations in the book, most of which related to the three men who gave evidence against me in the court case. Of course, they happen to be three of this columnist's most important superiors. There's nothing wrong with cozying up the boss when the opportunity arises, but it's always nice being lectured on ethics by the people who gave us Hackergate, the Melbourne Storm salary cap debacle and the Pauline Hanson fake pictures scandal. It's a little like being lectured on monogamy by Arnold Schwarzenegger, I've got to say. Ironically, the attack made no mention of the one revelation in the book that did genuinely raise ethical issues. During my period as editor of The Age, I was invited to lunch at Government House by the then Governor, Richard McGarvey, and as I write in the book, I thought I'd get there and there'd be a dozen people and we'd all get to ask one question and we'd all be scared stiff that we'd, drop our forks or something, and then we'd all go back to our offices. In fact, when I got there, it was just me and the Governor. And in a very confidential way, he told me that The Age needed to be strong in the face of a barrage of criticism that was raining down on us from Jeff Kennett. Now, I entered an agreement with the Governor at the time that I wouldn't put that story in The Age, and I honoured that agreement. Sadly, Richard McGarvey passed away in 2003, so when I came to write the book in 2010, I felt that the agreement had expired. I even took legal advice on it, and that was accepted, that with the passing of Richard McGarvey, any agreements had lapsed. So I included that in the book. I think it was 1 or 2 paragraphs. As luck or otherwise would have it, The Age picked up on that paragraph and led page 3 of one of its editions, and all hell broke loose. I received an angry denunciation by Richard McGarvey's son and predictably a slightly addled attack by Jeff Kennett. But despite the response, I was absolutely comfortable with writing it, and I still am. Nowhere in any of News Limited's attacks post-winning the court case did any of the writers reveal that 2 of their most senior executives who gave evidence in my case were criticised in very strong terms by the trial judge, one being called unreliable, an unreliable witness. Perhaps the ultimate comment on the culture of the company is that 1 year after the hearing and the judgment, the 2 men who were condemned in those very strong terms by Justice Stephen Cate over their evidence still occupy the same lofty positions within the organisation. It seems to not have affected their standing within the company one jot. Who knows, maybe it helped. Conversely, News is quick to punish those who go up against them. Entrepreneur Dick Smith admitted recently he'd foregone the opportunity to participate in a series of commercials backing the push to cut carbon pollution because he was frightened of how the Murdoch papers would portray him. Now, this is a powerful man, he's a wealthy man, but he admitted that he had been intimidated. He pointed to the treatment of actress Cate Blanchett, who did step up and do a commercial, as we all know, and was promptly mauled by the News Limited press. I know how that feels, but one of the many themes I explore in Man Bites Murdoch, clearly one of them is the need to confront bullies and bullying. At the end of the day, the book may be about a lot of things, but it's about one person and one person's family saying, enough is enough. I mean, I think we spend most of our lives trying to avoid confrontation. We compromise where we can. It's part of human nature. But I also think there are points in your life where you say, you know what, no, this is going too far. And that's what the book is about, ultimately. Certainly it's what the court case was about. Now, it's actually not just individuals who are intimidated. The Melbourne Press Club hasn't touched the book, which is odd, given that it's a recent history of the Melbourne Press, written by one of the few people who's edited both Melbourne dailies. In fact, I may be the only person who's done that. I've been told it's because the Herald and Weekly Times threatened to withdraw its funding for the club if they gave it any oxygen. So much for standing up to bullies. Ultimately, the future of newspapers and their many and varied platforms will come down to, I think, how much trust we place in them. It's as simple as that. Any outlet that doesn't accept it or understand it is doomed to fail. And I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. As I say in the final pages of the book, if the effect of all this is to break down the corporate behemoths that sprang up when newspapers suddenly became massively profitable, then perhaps we can return to what the famed former editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, used to call holy shit journalism. I, for one, don't believe that journalism is about to collapse simply because the delivery system changes from dead trees to digital. The internet didn't kill newspapers. It was the lazy and undisciplined way newspapers responded to the threat that did it. End quote. Now, there's another frog joke which I think captures the current state of newspapers, so look, perhaps I'll close on that. I don't know why I'm into frog jokes, but I am. I'll close on this frog joke. Two men are hiking through the bush on a Sunday afternoon when suddenly they see a frog sitting on a toadstool. To their astonishment, the frog speaks. Hey fellas, if one of you kisses me, I will turn into the world's best newspaper editor. With that, one of the men scoops up the frog and starts running back to camp very, very excitedly. As the men run faster and faster, the frog speaks up again. I told you fellas, if one of you kisses me, I'll turn into the world's best newspaper editor. Why won't you kiss me? Because, says the running man, we can make money out of a talking frog. Thanks for your attendance today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks for the talk, it was great. I'm a long-term Age reader, and I suppose I've spent, I don't know, $3,000 or so on the Age. As an editor, why didn't you ever want to know who I was? Why didn't you ever create some sort of loyalty scheme so that you'd know who I was and then be able to meet my needs? I mean, I don't want a newspaper about, most of the world. I'm interested in bicycles, sea kayaks, some politics, and that's the newspaper you need to create for me. Why didn't you ever create a loyalty scheme? It's
a terrific question, and it was a great frustration for me as an editor because the database existed with newsagents. Because in my period at the Age, and really until quite recently, you're in a sense subcontracting that work to your newsagent, and they reasonably jealously guided that database. So yes, apart from letters to the editor, which in the late 90s probably came in at the rate of 1,000 a week and probably have dropped off now, it was often very, very frustrating that we didn't know. And I remember in one election campaign, a federal election campaign, I said, look, I think we should bring the readers in and have forums in the building, and that was kind of, unheard of. But it was incredibly instructive. I think the digital platforms now make it much easier to know the readers. Apart from anything else, you can just see the instant response on stories, but I'm not sure newspapers are necessarily being, dovetailed to suit those interests. But I'm hoping, now that I'm out of newspapers, they're getting a lot better at it. At the Herald Sun, I used to get the only real contact I had with readers on any kind of more than a superficial level, but it was pretty superficial, was that Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock you would get the weekly reader report, which was really the product of people ringing in and telling you what they liked and didn't like the paper. It was always character building. You know, you would get hundreds of responses, and the stories you thought were really, you know, the public hated. It was amazing how often we were out of step with what those readers were telling us. So yeah, look, it's a big gap in the market, and it was a matter of regret for me when I was at the Age, and I'm sure it's still a matter of regret for Paul Ramage.
Have you seen the Age's iPad app, and if so, what do you think of it?
I have seen it, and look, I think it's impressive. I worry that it's a triumph of form over content. That when I look at, maybe it's just my print background, but when I look at that front page, there doesn't seem to be a lot on it. I know you click and you get headlines, but I think in time I'd like to see it settle down. So when I do go to the front page of the app, which for those who haven't seen it is essentially probably 4 pictures on an app size, an iPad size frame, that doesn't sort of say to me we've got the world covered. Go here, go there. But I think it's certainly attractive. I think it's an improvement on their previous one, and it's probably the best one out there at the moment. I'll be interested to see what News Limited comes up with in the future. I'd like to probably just see a little bit more content and a little less form.
I was over in Britain recently and got The Independent from time to time. And you're talking about a section for news and a section for opinion. As you might be aware, they have that thing called the Views paper, which is massive. In depth of perhaps 20 pages a day. Do you foresee that we might have access to something such as that here?
Well, I'm sure that the Age has probably investigated taking that service. But I think that what's happening now is that the internet is a conversation. I mean, the big difference between the internet and the newspaper is a monologue. I mean, we never, to go to the gentleman's first question down here, we never even met the readers. It was basically, here's what we think you should read, listen to us. If you want to send a letter, we may publish it. It was a monologue. And the internet is very much a dialogue. And I think that, increasingly, the more you can sort of make a conversation with readers on those online platforms, then you've got to use the paper, I think, to bring context to what's happened out there in the world. And I think the Views paper is exactly that. It's saying, OK, you already know what happened. You can pretty well find out. You could be sitting here now looking at your mobile phone and find out whether a car's crashed into a tram down in Swanston Street. But you'll maybe go to the newspaper and find out, well, what's the context of that? Why does it keep happening? Are the tram drivers at fault? Is it the street? Is it whatever? And I can see that newspapers increasingly are going to become that sort of vehicle. And then also for views as well. So I think it's inevitably happening and will continue to happen.
I suppose the appropriate question, considering your history as an editor, would you ever take on the editorship of a paper again within Australia or overseas?
Well, I remember I got asked this question once by Kerry O'Brien, actually on the 7:30 report, and I recalled, forgive people who may have seen that, I might as well tell another joke. It's not a frog. It doesn't involve a frog. But it's in Annie Hall where Woody Allen is summing up life, and he says, my brother thinks he goes to a psychologist and says, look, I've got a problem, Doc. My brother thinks he's a chicken. And the psychologist says, well, look, I think you should just sit him down and tell him that he isn't a chicken. Why don't you just sit him down and tell him? And he said, well, I'd do that, Doc, but I really need the eggs. And I think that, I could say here that, I don't ever edit a newspaper again, but part of me needs the eggs. The madness of newspapers is actually also the payoff. And I would certainly consider it, but I don't think it's going to happen. So, but yeah, I'd consider it, but I've been very fortunate. I look back and, I've had the best of the industry, and there's other exciting things happening out there, and probably the next step for me is to do something in an online space.